My son called me on a Tuesday morning, which was already strange because he never called on Tuesdays. He called on Sundays sometimes when his wife reminded him to. So when I saw his name on the screen at 8:17 in the morning, I felt something shift in my chest before I even picked up. Dad. His voice had that clipped quality I'd learned to recognize over the years. The one he used when he'd already decided something and was only telling me as a courtesy. I need you to know that Grandma passed last night. The funeral is Saturday. I've spoken with the estate attorney. Everything goes to me and Heather. The house, the accounts, the investment portfolio, all of it. A pause. There's nothing for you in the will. I was standing in my kitchen when he said this. I had a mug of coffee in my left hand, and the back door was open, and I could hear the neighbor's sprinkler going in the yard next door. My son was telling me that his grandmother, my mother, had died, and that I had been cut out of her estate. I said, I understand, Owen. He waited, like he expected me to argue. When I didn't, he said, she updated her documents 2 months ago. It's all legal. I'm sure it is, I said. Another pause, longer this time. Okay, he finally said. Okay, well, Saturday at 11, Lakeview Memorial. He hung up. I set my coffee down on the counter and looked out the back door at my yard. My mother's rose bushes, the ones she'd given me cuttings from 15 years ago, were blooming along the fence, pink and white and pale yellow, same as the ones she'd grown outside her kitchen window for 40 years. I smiled, because my mother was sitting in my living room. I should start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Russell. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county, raised my son mostly alone after his mother and I divorced when Owen was 9, and I have lived in the same house in Dayton, Ohio since 1997. I am not a dramatic man. I don't enjoy conflict. My mother used to say I had my father's temperament. Steady, quiet, slow to anger, slower to forget. My mother's name is Eleanor. She is 81 years old. And she is, as I said, very much alive. My son doesn't know that yet, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My mother was widowed when I was 34. My father died of a heart attack on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and the world changed in about the time it takes to hear a phone ring twice. He left behind a house on Maple Creek Road that they'd owned outright since 1989, a savings account, a modest stock portfolio my father had built quietly over 30 years of careful choices, and a life insurance policy. Altogether, when everything was settled, my mother was left with just over $900,000 in assets and a paid-off house in a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably since my parents bought it. She was also left with Owen, not full-time. Owen was an adult by then, 31, married to Heather, living 40 minutes away in Centerville. But Owen had always been close to my mother in a way that made me glad when I didn't look too carefully at it. He called her every few days. He came over to fix things. He drove her to appointments after she had a minor procedure on her knee 3 years ago, and stayed for dinner, and charmed her the way he'd always been able to charm people when he wanted something. I visited too. Every week, usually on Thursdays, I'd bring groceries if she needed anything. Sit with her at the kitchen table, listen to her talk about the neighbors and the news and whatever book she was reading. She was sharp, my mother. She did the crossword every morning in pen. She had opinions about things. Local politics, the quality of produce at the Kroger on Salem, the way her neighbor's son parked his truck, and she expressed them clearly and without apology. About 18 months ago, I noticed Owen was there more. A lot more. Sometimes when I'd arrive on Thursdays, his car would be in the driveway, and he and Heather would be inside, and there was always some minor project underway. A leaky faucet, gutters that needed clearing, a ceiling fan in the guest room that had developed a wobble. I told myself it was kindness. I wanted to believe it was kindness. The first time I felt something was wrong, I can't point to a specific moment. It was more like a temperature drop, a gradual, almost imperceptible cooling. My mother started mentioning things Owen had told her, about finances mostly, about how hard it was to keep up a house at her age. about whether it made more sense to simplify. She'd never talked that way before. Then, about 14 months ago, she mentioned that Owen had connected her with a financial advisor, a man named Trent, a friend of Owen's from his gym, who had come to the house twice to talk about her portfolio. "What kind of advice is he giving?" I asked. My mother looked at me over her coffee cup. "He's just helping me understand my options, Russell." I let it go. I wish I hadn't. 3 months later, she told me she'd moved her investment accounts, consolidated them, she said, under a new management firm that Trent had recommended. I asked for the name of the firm. She gave me a name I didn't recognize, and when I looked it up that night, I found very little. A recently registered LLC in Columbus, a sparse website, no listed history. I didn't sleep well that night. I called my mother's longtime attorney the next morning, a man named Howard Briggs, who had handled my parents' estate documents for decades, whom my father had trusted completely. Howard told me carefully that he was no longer representing my mother, that she had several weeks prior signed paperwork engaging a different firm for her estate needs. He couldn't tell me more than that. Attorney-client privilege didn't stop existing just because the client had changed attorneys. "Howard," I said, "is there anything you can tell me?" There was a long pause. "I'd suggest staying close, Russell," he said. "That's all I can say." I drove to my mother's house that afternoon without calling first. She was in the kitchen, and she looked fine, healthy, alert. She was a little surprised to see me on a Monday, but she put the kettle on and we sat down. I told her I was worried. I told her what I'd found when I looked up the investment firm. I told her that I wasn't trying to interfere, but that I loved her, and something felt wrong, and I needed her to know that I was paying attention. She listened to all of it. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at me with the same expression she used to give me when I was a boy, and she'd already figured out what I was going to say before I said it. "I know," she said. "You know, I've known for a while." She reached across the table and patted my hand. "I need you to trust me, Russell. Can you do that?" I looked at my mother, her steady gray eyes, her absolute composure, and I said yes, I could do that. What she told me over the next 2 hours was the most methodical, clear-eyed thing I have ever heard from another human being. She had been aware for months that Owen and Heather were attempting to position themselves as the sole beneficiaries of her estate. She had seen the pattern, the increased visits, the subtle suggestions about her health and her capacity, the introduction of their financial contact, the quiet isolation from her longtime attorney. She was not deceived. She was watching. "I've been doing this since before Owen was born," she said. "I know what it looks like when someone wants something." What she had done, in the months before I came to her that day, was this: she had contacted an elder law attorney in Cincinnati, not someone connected to anyone in our local circle, and she had spent 3 months working with him to restructure her estate. The house on Maple Creek Road had been transferred into an irrevocable trust. Her investment accounts had been moved, not to Trent's firm, as she had told Owen, but to an independent fiduciary she had found through her attorney. The accounts Owen believed were under new management were real accounts, but they held a small, managed fraction of her actual assets, enough to look convincing, not enough to matter. "The financial advisor I mentioned to Owen," she said, "is real. He exists, he's licensed, and he manages a portion of my assets. What Owen doesn't know is that portion is under $200,000. The rest is already in trust." I sat with that for a moment. The house, transferred 8 months ago. I still live in it. I still own the right to live in it until my death, but it doesn't pass through my estate. It goes directly to a charitable remainder trust I established for the Dayton Children's Hospital Foundation. Your father volunteered there for 11 years. She said it simply, like she was reading from a list. "Mom, I've also kept documentation," she said. "Every visit Owen made where he mentioned my finances or my health. Every conversation where Heather suggested I might need more help than I was getting. The night Trent came to the house with paperwork I hadn't requested and tried to get me to sign a new POA naming Owen as my agent. I had a recording device in the room. She looked at me with something close to calm satisfaction. I've given everything to my attorney. He has been in contact with the appropriate authorities about Trent specifically. I put my face in my hands, not from grief, from something closer to awe. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Because I needed you to react naturally, she said. I needed your surprise to be real if it came to that. I'm sorry, Russell. I knew it was hard on you. We sat together for a long time after that. She made more tea. We talked about my father, about the rose bushes, about things that had nothing to do with any of it. When I left that evening, she walked me to the door and held my face in both her hands the way she used to when I was small. Stay close, she said, but let it play out. So I did. Owen had been growing bolder over the following weeks. He had apparently been told by Trent, or whoever Trent was actually working for, that my mother was in the process of legally transferring assets and that the window for influencing the process was closing. This explained why 6 weeks before my son's phone call, things had escalated. I didn't know about it until my mother told me afterward, but on a Thursday evening when I wasn't there, Owen had come to the house with Heather. He had brought a man, not Trent, someone new, who had presented my mother with updated power of attorney documents. The documents, if she had signed them, would have given Owen sole legal authority over her financial and healthcare decisions. My mother told me she had served them coffee. She had listened to the man explain the documents. She had asked several clarifying questions, calmly and precisely, which she later told me were designed to get Owen and Heather to say certain things on the record. Then she had said she would need a few days to review everything with her own attorney. The man looked at Owen. Owen looked at my mother. "Mom," he said, "you don't need to complicate this. We're just trying to help." "I know you are," she said, "and I appreciate it. I just want to make sure I understand everything I'm signing." They left. My mother called her attorney from Cincinnati the same evening. What happened over the following month, I learned in pieces. Trent was not a licensed financial advisor in the state of Ohio, as it turned out. His registration had lapsed 2 years prior and had not been renewed. The documents he had previously had my mother sign had been reviewed by my mother's attorney and found to contain language that would have granted Owen co-trustee status over accounts that didn't actually exist in the form described. My mother's attorney, working with a contact at the Ohio Department of Commerce's Division of Securities, had filed a formal complaint. I did not know any of this was happening. I was going to work, coming home, calling my mother on Thursdays, and waiting. The call came from Owen on a Tuesday. He told me his grandmother had died. He told me I was getting nothing. He told me the estate had been settled in his favor and that everything was legal. I said I understood. I hung up the phone. I walked into my living room, where my mother was sitting in the armchair by the window with a cup of tea and a library book, and I told her what Owen had said. She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting it. "He found out I'd transferred the accounts," she said. "Not everything, just enough for him to think he understood what had happened." She set down her book. "He doesn't know about the trust. He doesn't know about the complaint. He thinks he's won." She had been staying with me for 4 days by then. She had told Owen, through an intermediary, a friend of hers who Owen had no reason to distrust, that she had been feeling unwell and had gone to stay with a cousin in Indianapolis. Owen had not called to check. He had not driven to the house to see for himself. He had apparently accepted the information and moved quickly to take advantage of the situation he believed existed. The funeral he had scheduled was for a woman who was not dead. He had, as my mother had anticipated, jumped. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it matters. I'm not a man who enjoys watching someone suffer, even someone who has done something genuinely wrong. Owen is my son. I raised him, loved him, drove him to baseball practice, and helped him with his college applications and stood next to him at his wedding with a full heart. What he did to my mother, what he tried to do, is a betrayal I will carry for the rest of my life. But when I walked into that funeral home on a Saturday morning and saw him standing near the entrance in a dark suit, looking important, accepting condolences from people who thought his grandmother was dead, I did not feel anger. I felt grief. Real grief for the person I had believed he was. My mother walked in beside me. She was wearing her good blue coat, the cashmere one she saves for holidays and formal occasions. Her white hair was done, her lipstick was on, and she walked with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who had been playing a long game and had just reached the end of it. Owen saw her from across the room. I watched his face go through about 7 different things in the space of 3 seconds. Shock first, then something almost like relief, a wild, involuntary flicker, as if some part of him hadn't quite believed what he'd been told. Then, as the room went quiet around him and people started to turn, something else came over him, a collapsing, like a structure giving way. Heather, standing beside him, made a sound I can't describe. My mother walked straight to Owen. She stopped in front of him, looked up at him. He has 6 inches on her, and said in a perfectly even voice, "Hello, sweetheart." He said her name. Just her name. Nothing else. "I think," she said, "we should find somewhere to talk." There was a small meeting room off the main hallway. We went in, my mother and Owen and Heather and myself and the funeral home director, a confused and increasingly alarmed man who had, it turns out, also received a quiet call that morning from my mother's attorney in Cincinnati. The director had been asked to allow the morning's events to proceed as scheduled and to ensure a certain representative from the Ohio Attorney General's office had access to the premises. Owen tried several things in that room. He tried confusion, acted as though he didn't understand, as though there had been some terrible mistake. He tried anger briefly. He looked at me, once with an expression that I think was a plea. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. My mother did most of the talking. She was the calmest person in the room by a significant margin. She explained, quietly and without drama, what she knew, what she had documented, and what had already been submitted to the authorities. She explained that Trent was facing a formal investigation. She explained that the estate documents Owen believed were finalized contained nothing of what he expected because the assets he had expected to inherit had already been restructured. She explained that the house on Maple Creek Road was held in an irrevocable trust for the Children's Hospital, as my father had always wanted, and that no action Owen took now or later would change that. "You don't have to say anything right now," she told him, "but I want you to understand that this is done, and I want you to hear it from me, not from a lawyer." Owen and Heather left without the funeral proceeding. I don't know exactly what conversations they had with the representative who met them outside, because my mother and I stayed in the meeting room for a while. She sat down. For the first time in the whole of that morning, she looked tired. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm fine," she said. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I'm sad," she said then. "I keep waiting to stop being sad about it." "I know," I said. We stayed in that room until the tiredness passed, and then we went out together into the autumn morning, and I drove her back to my house, where her things were still in the guest room and the rose bushes along the fence were still blooming. She stayed with me for 3 more weeks. We had Thanksgiving together that year, just the 2 of us, and I made her my father's stuffing recipe, the one with apples and sage, that he made every year, and we ate at the kitchen table and talked about him for a long time. It was the best Thanksgiving I can remember. The legal proceedings involving Trent took the better part of 8 months to resolve. My mother's attorney kept her informed. I won't detail all of it, but the outcome was not comfortable for the people involved. Owen and Heather faced a civil matter separate from Trent's criminal exposure. They engaged their own attorneys. There were several months when Owen and I did not speak. He called me eventually, last February, on a Sunday. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without qualifications, without explanations. He said he didn't know how to explain what he'd been thinking except that he'd told himself a story about it that had seemed, somehow, acceptable to him at the time, and that when he saw his grandmother walk into that room, he understood for the first time that the story he'd told himself wasn't true. I told him I heard him. I told him it would take time. That's where things are now. Time and honesty. And the slow work of figuring out whether trust is something that can be rebuilt when it's been taken apart the way ours was. I don't know yet. I think I won't know for a while. My mother still lives in her house on Maple Creek Road. She is doing her crossword every morning, tending the rose bushes, playing bridge with the women from her church on Wednesday afternoons. She calls me every Thursday. She sounds like herself. Last spring, the Children's Hospital Foundation sent her a letter acknowledging the trust arrangement and thanking her for her generosity. She brought it with her when she came for Sunday dinner and left it on my kitchen table without saying anything. Just set it down beside the pepper grinder and went to hang up her coat. When I read it, I noticed that the trust had been formally named in my father's memory. I called her into the kitchen. "Mom," I said. She looked at me from the doorway with that expression I've known my whole life. "He would have wanted it," she said. And besides, she came in and picked up her water glass and looked at me with something very close to a smile. "Nobody should be able to buy your loyalty with money, Russell. Not even family. If it can be bought, it isn't really yours." I've thought about that a lot since she said it. I think she's right. I think she's been right about most things for most of my life, and I was just too close to it to see clearly. That's the thing about watching someone you love exercise that kind of quiet strength. You realize the steadiness was always there. You just didn't know what it was capable of until it was tested. I'm glad she taught me that. Even if the lesson cost us both something we'll never quite get back. I keep coming back to one image. My mother in her blue cashmere coat walking through the doors of that funeral home. Not rushed, not triumphant, just steady, the way she had always been steady, for as long as I could remember. People talk about consequences like there's something that arrives from the outside, like punishment handed down from somewhere above. But watching what happened to Owen, and what didn't happen to my mother, I've come to think it works differently than that. The consequences were already built into the choices. Owen chose to see his grandmother as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved, and that choice narrowed him. It narrowed his thinking, his patience, his ability to read the room. He got so focused on what he believed was coming to him that he stopped paying attention to the person right in front of him. And my mother, who had been paying attention her whole life, saw everything he missed. That's what I think about when I think about what she did. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even just intelligence. Though she is one of the sharpest people I have ever known. It was character. It was the kind of person she had spent 81 years becoming, someone who reads situations clearly, who doesn't let emotion override judgment, who plans carefully and acts at the right moment and never once mistakes impatience for strength. You don't build that in a crisis. You build it in every ordinary day that comes before the crisis, in every small decision about whether to pay attention or look away, whether to act with integrity when no one is watching, whether to keep showing up for people even when showing up costs you something. I think about my own part in this too. The years I told myself Owen's attention to his grandmother was kindness. The times I felt something was wrong and talked myself out of it. I wasn't dishonest. I just didn't want to see clearly, because seeing clearly would have required me to act, and acting on what I suspected about my own son was something I wasn't ready for. There's a cost to that kind of avoidance. I paid it in months of worry and sleeplessness and the grief I couldn't even name yet because the loss hadn't fully happened. My mother didn't have the luxury of looking away, so she didn't. That's the difference I keep turning over. Eleanor told me once, when I was maybe 12 years old, that the most important thing a person could do was think before they acted and act when they'd finished thinking. She said most people do it the other way around. They act first and think later, and spend the rest of their time trying to manage the consequences. I thought it was just something Mother said. I didn't understand she was describing how she actually lived. Owen called me last February. He said he was sorry. I believe him. I also know that sorry is the beginning of something, not the end of it. rebuilding what was broken between us, if we can rebuild it, is going to take the same qualities my mother demonstrated: patience, honesty, the willingness to keep showing up even when it's uncomfortable. Whether he has those things now, whether the experience built them in him the way I hope it did, I don't know yet. What I know is what I learned from watching my mother: that the quiet, consistent work of being a person of good character is not wasted, even when it seems like it is. That the people who love you without wanting anything from you are the ones worth protecting. And that the most powerful thing in any room is not the person making the most noise. It's the person who already knows how the story ends.